There's no way to describe what Alaska is. A vacation up there is too special for that.
Isn't it time you discovered what a vacation to Alaska can mean to you? To get your free Alaska vacation boost.
Good evening. Violent crime statistics in Alaska for the first 10 months of last year show murders and robberies are up over 1981. Figures released today by Alaska State Troopers show homicides at 62 as compared to 60 last year.
In the dark and chilling history of serial killers and true crime, we often find that there are stories that leave us empty and cold at the realization of what evil is capable of. One of the worst begins on a cold Alaskan night where a young woman named Cindy Paulson found herself ensnared in the web of a predator unlike any other. Picture a red light district on the corners in Anchorage, Alaska, 1983, where the neon glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the icy pavements. It was here, on the frigid streets of 5th and Denali, that Cindy's harrowing journey began. She was offered an unusually high sum for what was supposed to be a seemingly routine adult transaction. She accompanied her client to his house, unaware of the horrors that awaited her within those walls. Little did Cindy know that her encounter with an unassuming man named Robert Hansen would thrust her into the heart of a twisted game of survival, shackled, assaulted, and left for dead in a remote cabin in the Alaskan wilderness. Cindy's desperate escape would ignite a chain of events that would ultimately reveal a serial killer and shake the very foundations of the last frontier. Hey, what's up? Just a couple of important things before we get into the Robert Hansen video, but I promise to make it quick. I put a lot of work into this one and I'm excited to share this work with you. First, I want to say thank you for checking out the video. I really appreciate it, and more than anything, engaging by subscribing, liking, and commenting would really help out the channel. It's completely free to do, and you can undo it at any time. Also, I really like the discourse and the discussion part, so if you want to leave a comment, if you ever want to shoot me ideas for content, you can leave them in the comments here, or you can shoot a DM on my other socials that are going to be linked down below. Secondly, when doing research for this video, I keep seeing how people almost romanticize this subject matter, and I really want to push a reminder for when we approach this kind of dialogue, especially with these subjects, that we do it with respect and integrity. I hope to inform, and we gotta recognize that there's bad people out there. And I hope, if anything, these stories are learned from, and more than anything, I hope everyone stays safe, vigilant, and aware. Yeah, and with that being said, let's get right on into the Robert Hansen video. We're gonna take a look into Cindy Paulson's ordeal and peel back some of the layers to this case and Robert Hansen's depraved existence. Robert Bob Hansen, widely known as the Butcher Baker, gained notoriety as an American serial killer operating in Anchorage, Alaska from 1972 to 1983. Hansen's modus operandi typically involved abducting, sexually assaulting, and ultimately murdering his victims, totaling at least 17 women over an 11-year period. His weapon of choice was predominantly a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, often accompanied by a hunting knife. Despite the sensationalized portrayal of Hansen as a rugged Alaskan boogeyman in various media outlets, including major network TV specials and the 2013 film The Frozen Ground, starring John Cusack as Hansen opposite Nicolas Cage.
He won't stop, and we know who he is.
The reality of Hansen's character diverged significantly from this image. Contrary to the popular perception, Hansen was described by those who encountered him, including the women who survived his attacks, as a weak and wimpy individual. Physically, he was characterized as acne-covered and often seen wearing large froghorn glasses. In truth, Hansen's motivation stemmed from a deep-seated desire for validation, respect, and power, traits that he lacked in his personal life, despite The heinous nature of his crimes, Hansen's demeanor reflected that of a pitiful and socially inept individual, rather than the formidable figure often depicted in media portrayals. Despite his notably low IQ, Hansen exhibited a surprising level of detail and organization, and this likely contributed to his ability to evade capture for an extended period, coupled with lapses in police work. This meticulous approach allowed him to cover his tracks pretty efficiently. Hansen apparently had a thing for lists, maps, and checklists. However, beneath the facade of organization lays a disturbingly skewed perception of women. This guy had a Madonna whore complex. Women were either revered as goddesses in need of rescue or vilified as deserving of punishment. This psychological factor for him is rooted in misogyny and a disturbing disconnect from recognizing women as individuals with autonomy and humanity.
Involuntary celibate.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
these
so this
people are
is-
killing people.
Santa Barbara a couple of years ago, he
Yes.
was also like, I'm so attractive, why don't you guys want to have sex with me? It's when
better
people
friends.
blame women and are violent misogynists because they are, they think that they're unattractive, and they're basically just blame like attractive women for not having sex with them. It's really disturbing.
There's like some sort of a Reddit forum with all these folks, and there's like 40,000
Oh,
members.
totally.
In a modern context, Hansen's mentality aligns with the extreme fringes of online incel culture, where disaffected men harbor resentment towards women and seek validation through violence and control. Hansen's targets primarily exotic dancers from establishments like the Kit Kat Club, Wild Cherry, and the Gentleman's Retreat, highlight his objectification of women and his detachment from their humanity. In his confessions, Hansen callously referred to his murders as summertime projects. He didn't see them as human, and it made it so much easier for him to commit these crimes. The facts of the case suggest that Hansen was not the terrifying figure portrayed in movies and TV, but rather a troubled individual who took out his insecurities on vulnerable women in the sex work industry, knowing that their disappearances would receive less attention from the police in Alaska. And to understand how Hansen became this way, we gotta take a look into his background. Robert Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, to Edna Margaret and Christian Hansen, a baker. Growing up, Hansen faced constant disappointment from his father, who was described as an overbearing and harsh guy. His father's strict Catholic beliefs even led him to force Hansen to use his right hand instead of his left, which he naturally favored. This upbringing left Hansen feeling shy, nervous, and isolated, especially from his father. Despite the family business being baking, Hansen showed no interest and preferred spending his time practicing throwing knives and archery behind the bakery. His father's constant yelling and criticism only pushed him further away from the family trade. Hansen's struggles were compounded by a severe stutter and severe acne, which isolated him and made it difficult to form normal relationships. Many people believe these factors doomed him to a life of loneliness and frustration. In school, Robert struggled to make friends due to his being perceived as a weird knife kid with a speech impediment. So essentially, school sucked, especially as he entered the teenage years and developed severe acne, which became a defining physical feature throughout his life. Rather than overcoming these challenges, Hansen allowed his insecurities and resentment to fester, leading to a deep-seated hatred and insecurity. Seeking validation and respect, he pursued avenues like joining the local junior police inspector program, in the hope that wearing the uniform would command respect. However, he didn't pursue a career in law enforcement after high school.
This is the Army, where just 2 years can really pay off.
Instead, he enlisted in the United States Army, viewing it as a means to attain the universal respect he craved by associating himself with the heroic image of a serviceman. While many individuals serve in the military out of a genuine desire to protect their nation, Hansen's motivations were different. He sought to exploit the public's reverence for soldiers to elevate his own status, leveraging the admiration bestowed upon military personnel for his own selfish gains. Robert Hansen's military service was largely uneventful apart from one notable incident in New York City. Recognized as the USO's Soldier of the Week, Hansen and a few fellow soldiers were granted some time off. It was during this leave that Hansen had his first paid sexual encounter with a woman. Reflecting on this experience, Hansen described it as brief and transactional, lacking any emotional connection. This is what Hansen had to say about the interaction.
I gotta feel it, but that was about it. Everything was very slam bam, thank you, ma'am. I didn't even get a hug and I couldn't even sleep in the bed.
What was supposed to be a typical outing among soldiers celebrating their comrades' recognition quickly turned into an introspective ordeal for Robert. While his fellow soldiers likely viewed the encounter with a sex worker as a casual affair, Robert internalized it, unable to process it with emotional maturity. He harbored a sense of entitlement, expecting the woman to reciprocate his feelings. Upon returning home after basic training, Robert carried the weight of unresolved resentment. His self-esteem remained battered, compounded by a disheartening encounter with the police chief, finding Robert alone behind his father's bakery, immersed in a solitary session of knife throwing. The police chief deemed him unfit for his role as a junior police inspector. At nearly 20 years old, Robert's erratic behavior and ominous mutterings led to his expulsion from the organization. After his expulsion from the junior police inspector program, Robert sought solace in the company of high school students employed at his father's bakery. The unlikely alliance formed a makeshift delinquent gang composed of Robert and the town's less refined youth. Their activities ranged from aimless mischief to reckless discussions of destructive acts, like blowing up the town's water tower, a plan that never materialized due to their lack of technical ability. Robert's disdain for his small-town high school persisted long after graduation, even as he ventured into the larger world during his military service. Consumed by a desire for revenge, he seized an opportunity to strike back by setting fire to the school's bus barn during a distracting basketball game. Taking advantage of his volunteer firefighter role, Robert remained at the scene to witness the devastation he caused, finding a perverse satisfaction in the chaos. Despite his efforts to evade blame, word of his involvement spread rapidly through the town. Somehow, in the middle of the entire controversy, Robert managed to marry Phoebe Paget, a fellow outsider in their small community. However, Phoebe's family did not want anything to do with Robert. I mean, they could see it from a mile away, that this dude was nuts and wanted their daughter nowhere near him. So police picked him up and he agreed to do a polygraph and questioning about the fire. But he failed the lie detector test and stupidly made some kind of ill-advised comments about bombing the police chief. So it makes sense that Robert's life took a downward spiral. He publicly maintained his innocence and says he chose to plead guilty in court to avoid negative publicity for the town of Pocahontas. His marriage to Phoebe quickly unraveled, with her filing for divorce immediately after his private confession to her about his part in the fire. Robert's dad picked up and sort of made it his mission to prove his son's innocence, making flyers and trying to get a petition going to have his son's sentence overturned. He may have been stern and stiff and strict, but he believed that if his son said he was innocent, he would do what he could to get him out. Facing the reality of his situation, Robert confided in his father, who had tirelessly campaigned for his innocence. The revelation left his father shattered and ashamed, leading him to sell the family bakery and relocate to a resort in Minnesota. Robert, upon release from prison, joined his family there, finding solace in baking once again. Over time, he built a solid reputation as a talented baker in his community. In Minnesota, Robert would eventually meet the woman who would become his wife until his arrest in 1983. It appeared that their romance blossomed swiftly, with Robert and Darla deeply enamored with each other. However, as summer waned and Darla resumed her studies, Robert's impatience grew. He proposed to Darla, persuading her with promises of a fresh start, citing his successful career as a baker as evidence of their potential for a good life together. With newfound marital bliss, the couple ventured to Anchorage, Alaska, where they established Hansen's Bakery, eager to embark on their journey as husband and wife. During this period, Anchorage underwent a significant transformation. Initially known as a haven for loners seeking refuge from the bustling city life, the city experienced an oil boom, attracting a surge of workers. With such economic growth came an inevitable rise in the sex industry, catering to the needs of an influx of single, lonely workers. The Anchorage of the 1970s existed in a unique blend of frontier spirit and modern conveniences amidst the backdrop of burgeoning oil wealth and recreational ski resorts. Because of this, we could see that transient lifestyles were commonplace among women in the sex trade. Working through various circuits along the West Coast, from San Diego to Vancouver, these topless dancers eventually found themselves in Anchorage before restarting the cycle all over again. This transient nature facilitated a climate where so many women that didn't have any roots or local familiar support network passed through town almost daily. They were completely anonymous and no one really knew who they were. All this created an environment where being a sex worker was pretty dangerous, leading to disappearances and a lack of any serious attention from law enforcement. This is what provided fertile ground for Robert Hansen to evolve into the most gruesome and infamous serial killer the state of Alaska has ever hopefully witnessed. Shortly after landing in Anchorage, Robert managed to establish his bakery on the corner of 9th and Ingra, strategically positioned near one of the city's main streets in close proximity to the red light district. I think it's a combination of environment and his own individual predisposition that shaped his descent into darkness. Anchorage, in a lot of ways, gave him the room and opportunity to be evil. Had he remained in Iowa, it's entirely possible that none of these horrific acts would have even happened, or at least not escalated to the extent that they did. This is a mix of, I'd say, 60% built-in traits and 40% opportunity. Hansen's location next to the red light district exposed him to a world of vice and vulnerability, fueling his dark fantasies and setting the stage for his crimes. His obsession with women coming in and out of the shop grew as he observed their transient nature and their frequent disappearances. It dawned on him that these women were often overlooked, their comings and goings unnoticed by most. This realization planted the seed for his dark fantasies to take root. The Anchorage Tenderloin District, with its abundance of strip clubs and women willing to engage in more than just dancing, provided fertile ground for Hansen's twisted desires. But for him, it wasn't initially about the women, it was about the thrill of the hunt. Hansen's fascination with guns, his nerdy hobby, coincided perfectly with the darker impulses brewing within him. The hunting became an outlet for his inner darkness, a precursor to the horrors that would follow. His descent into depravity began nearly a decade before his first confirmed murder. In December 1971, Hansen's simmering resentment boiled over when he followed a customer from his bakery to her home. His attempt to coerce her into a date ended in rejection, fueling his rage. A week later, he returned armed, intending to kidnap her. Fortunately, he was apprehended in the act. This instance just proves the age-old adage that men fear embarrassment while women fear for their lives. Robert Hansen personified that fear. Well, the thing is, he wasn't really good at this whole predator thing. In fact, he was pretty bad at it. He kept failing, and it became clear that hunting animals wasn't enough for him, and he wanted to hunt something else: women. After he was arrested for trying to kidnap a woman, he tried again, maybe even 2 more times, and someone ended up dead. There's this one case around Christmas where a woman named Celia Van Zanten was found dead in the park, her hands tied behind her back with wire, and she had been cut. But the cold got to her before her attacker could. She fought hard to survive and showed real signs of strength and smarts. Hansen denied being involved, but then another woman came forward, saying she was kidnapped by him. She managed to talk her way out of it, but he threatened her family if she told anyone. She kept quiet until she was convinced to report it. It's possible she played into his emotions, manipulating him to spare her. There's this moment when he dropped her off and he said something like, "I wish we had met under better circumstances." Maybe she leaned into that, trying to make him feel something more than just anger or violence. She may have switched from being a target to being someone he felt a connection to. When cops brought Hansen in, they had some evidence against him. He used an alias at the motel where he had taken Robin, but they still got a handwriting sample from him. And when they asked him to empty his wallet for comparison, a piece of paper with Robin's father's address fell out. But the cops hesitated to search his wallet without a warrant, worried it might make the evidence inadmissible. Plus, Hansen ran a bakery where the cops often hung out, so there was a level of familiarity there. Eventually, Hansen's friends came to his aid. He had friends in respectable places like insurance agents and church acquaintances who vouched for him and even provided fake alibis. But what's really messed up is how the police treated sex workers in Anchorage. They basically told Hansen he could do whatever he wanted because they didn't care about the prostitutes. It wasn't just neglect, it was like they were actively looking for ways to let Hansen off the hook. In one case, they didn't let a woman testify because she was a school teacher and they were afraid that they would be liable for her losing her job. What eventually got Hansen temporarily put away was something the establishment valued more than the women of Anchorage: a chainsaw. In 1976, Hansen saw an overweight man having a heart attack outside of Fred Meyer's store, reminding him of his father, who also had a heart condition and was overweight. This triggered thoughts of Christmas approaching and led Hansen to pick up a chainsaw for his dad inside the store. He placed an old receipt on top of the box and tried to walk out without paying, but he was caught and arrested almost immediately. This wasn't Hansen's first time stealing. By then, he had become a full-blown kleptomaniac, which often precedes much more serious criminal behavior like serial killing. In his confession, Hansen admitted, "I have a thing about taking things because I just love to see if I could get by with it. My gosh. I damn near ejaculate my pants if I could walk into a store and take something and get out the dang door with it, not pay for it." For stealing the chainsaw, Hansen was sentenced to 5 years in prison. I think this is a case of the judge seeing his criminal history of violence with women kind of starting to add up, and in that moment hitting him with the book and giving as much time as he can, trying to do his best to keep this guy off the streets, or maybe the judge simply didn't like him. But somehow he would end up back on the streets in just 16 months. Hansen's murderous spree began about a year later. The first victim, whose real name remains unknown, came to be called Eklutna Annie. In the summer of 1979, Hansen kidnapped her and drove her to Eklutna Lake, northeast of Anchorage. It's likely Hansen didn't intend to kill her that night, but things escalated and she ended up dead. This incident seemed to embolden him, feeling confident in his element in the wilderness. Not far into the trip, Hansen's truck got stuck in the mud, embarrassing him. He told the girl he had lost interest and would take her home once he got unstuck, but she didn't believe him and ran off into the darkness. Hansen chased after her, grabbed her hair, and a struggle ensued. He managed to wrestle the knife from her and had fatally stabbed her. Another woman faced a similar ordeal a couple of months later in his camper, but she managed to escape. Despite showing up at a stranger's house naked and bound by guitar strings, the cops believed Hansen's version over hers. This is what Hansen had to say about the camper incident during his final interrogations.
I said I'm gonna drop you off right back uptown and that's it, you know. But when she was up in the cab of the truck, she had that locked and had the back window there locked, and I couldn't get into her. The key for the camper was up sitting on the dash. I had the truck keys, my keys in my hand, but she was locked in the cab with the keys to get into the goddamn camper from the back end, you know. And she was sitting in there and, you know, had the doors locked, but I couldn't get into her. And I showed her right where the goddamn key is, it was laying right in fucking plain sight, you know, on the dash of the car, or it was in the pickup. I said, how in the hell can I get them, you know? Anyway, she kept on screaming, and I just frickin' got mad, and I stuck my hand in and punched the windshield or the side window and knocked that completely out, and said something about, no, I'll get the fucking keys, you know, and reached in for them. And then she jumped out the other side door and ran away, you know.
6 months later, Roxanne Eastland became Hansen's second victim. Discovered only after his arrest, his third victim, Joanne Messina, also met a gruesome fate. After meeting Hansen at the docks in Anchorage, they went for dinner nearby. When Messina hinted at needing work, Hansen interpreted it as a preposition. Once money was mentioned, Hansen's perception of her changed, leading him to see her as less than human. This mindset prompted him to kill her in a remote spot in the Kenai Peninsula. In a chilling turn of events, it wasn't a human who stumbled upon Messina's body first, but an endangered black bear. This highlights the eerie and dangerous nature of Alaska, where hikers can vanish amid rapidly changing weather and encounters with deadly animals. When investigators arrived, they found that the bear had already scavenged the crime scene, but returned later. Despite attempts to scare it away, the bear became increasingly aggressive, leading authorities to prioritize preserving the crime scene over the bear's presence. Hansen claimed that he never intended to kill the women that he picked up, and he justified his actions by stating that he only resorted to murder if his victims didn't comply with his desires. This twisted rationale is common among serial killers, particularly those who target sex workers. As they seek to justify their heinous acts, Hansen admitted to taking over 50 women into the Alaskan wilderness, with 17 of them meeting their tragic end due to what he perceived as betrayal. Despite Hansen's reign of terror, the lack of communication among sex workers also allowed him to continue his murderous spree unchecked. Reminiscent of other notorious serial killers like Robert Pickton, whose actions went unnoticed by many in the Vancouver scene for an extended period. Despite Hansen's reputation and the risks associated with him, women continued to be lured by his facade of a romantic relationship. They saw an opportunity to exploit his delusions and extract money without explicitly discussing payment, which likely appealed to many. Hansen's gullibility and willingness to play along with their charade made him an easy target for manipulation. In Anchorage, the situation was even more precarious due to the rapid turnover of sex workers, with new dancers constantly cycling through strip clubs every 6 months or so. There was a constant influx of vulnerable individuals for predators like Hansen to prey upon. Despite the relatively small size of Anchorage, the abundance of strip clubs provided ample opportunities for nefarious actions to take place. Despite his cunning behavior within city limits, Hansen's intelligence didn't necessarily reflect in standardized tests. However, Hansen compensated for any lack of academic intelligence with his ability to manipulate and deceive his victims, ultimately leading to his deadly actions. Robert Hansen had an extensive collection of disguises, including skin adhesives, nail polish, and fake mustaches. And it seemed that Hansen mostly used these disguises to boost his own self-esteem. While they did serve a purpose of concealing his identity, Hansen also admitted that he used the fake mustache because he didn't consider himself the most attractive person, and he thought it would make things easier. He even tried growing a real mustache at one point, but found that it didn't suit him. Despite his eccentricities, Hansen was smart in his approach to disguises. He avoided overly flashy outfits and instead dressed as something mundane, like a doctor or lawyer, to blend in seamlessly. This allowed him to appear somewhat different each time while remaining nondescript. Hansen's modus operandi involved meeting women in topless clubs and offering them large sums of money for nude photography sessions or lunch. He would then arrange a second meeting outside the club, usually at a local Wendy's restaurant. Hansen would observe the woman's arrival from his parked car just to ensure that they were alone, and if they arrived with company, he would cancel the meeting and leave. Hansen targeted newcomers or those with few connections as they were less likely to be missed. After luring the women to a second location under the pretense of photography, Hansen would reveal his true intentions and take them into the wilderness, where he would commit his heinous acts. Hansen's killing spree was still in its early stages, characterized by a stop-and-go pattern. He hadn't yet reached the point of full addiction where he required more frequent and brutal kills to satisfy his urges. However, he was beginning to give himself allowances, which contributed to his evolution as a killer. According to Hansen, his victims would remain alive until they panicked. But as time went on, he increasingly put them in situations where panic was inevitable. One such example is the case of Sherry Moreau. The night before her disappearance, she had confided in a friend about a stranger offering her $300 for an erotic photo shoot, a significant sum in 1970s Anchorage, Alaska. Intrigued by the money, Sherry agreed to the arrangement, and soon she found herself in the passenger seat of Robert Hansen's Subaru heading towards Pioneer Peak along the Knik River to an abandoned lean-to with an ace bandage wrapped around her eyes. Hansen explained that the ace bandage served a dual purpose. Firstly, it was intended to provide a cover story in case Moreau went to the police afterward. If she did, she could lead them to the location, limiting Hansen's ability to deny any involvement. Secondly, it ensured that Moreau had less opportunity to identify him or his vehicle if she managed to escape. However, things did not go according to Hansen's plan this time when Hansen's vehicle got stuck once again. Moreau seized the opportunity to escape, running blindly with her hands tied into the wilderness. Hansen pursued her, and according to his account, the murder was carried out in a chillingly casual manner, with him sitting down and staring at her as she screamed. To him, it was as simple as pointing and shooting and then thinking to himself, oh, well, I guess I'm done with this one. Hansen's murder of Sherry Moreau marked a significant point in his criminal activity, where he made a couple of notable slip-ups. Despite being a hunter, Hansen was too squeamish to take physical trophies from his victims. Instead, he opted for jewelry and IDs as mementos, giving him a sense of accomplishment. However, this led to his downfall, as these items were crucial evidence for his eventual arrest. One of Hansen's blunders was burying Moreau in a shallow grave near where he had fired the fatal shot. Additionally, Hansen left the shell casings at the scene, a habit typical of hunters who don't always collect their spent cartridges. These shell casings became key evidence linking Hansen to multiple crime scenes. When Moreau's body was discovered almost a year later, investigators found a .223 caliber shell casing, providing a tangible lead. When Moreau was the first victim officially linked to Hansen, he had already claimed 3 more victims by the time her body was found. Initially, law enforcement had viewed the disappearances as isolated events, possibly involving drifters passing through town. However, with 2 bodies found buried nearby, suspicions turned to the possibility of a serial murderer, particularly given the remote locations of the graves. During his killing spree's later stages, Hansen committed an insurance scam involving his hunting trophies, which netted him $13,000. With this money, he purchased a private aircraft, a Super Cub, which he had not only used for transportation but also for criminal activities. The narrative of Robert Hansen hunting women in the Alaskan wilderness has been a long-held claim, but the evidence doesn't strongly support this notion. Hansen himself never admitted to hunting women, and forensic evidence doesn't definitely suggest it either. One argument against the idea of Hansen hunting women intentionally is his preferred hunting weapon, the crossbow. While he did use guns at times, his hunting records indicate a preference for archery. If Hansen were truly hunting women like animals, he might have used a weapon that he was more comfortable with. Additionally, there was no evidence of scratches or blood on the trails typically associated with being a hunter. Moreover, Hansen mentioned instances where women almost got their hands on his guns, suggesting a struggle rather than a controlled hunt. These women didn't show signs of running through branches or any of the typical hunting scenarios. It's possible that the media sensationalized the story, as they often do, by drawing parallels between Hansen's hunting hobby and his crimes. While Hansen's crimes were undoubtedly heinous, the notion of him hunting women like game may be more fiction than fact. It seems more likely that Robert Hansen's murders followed a pattern where he would take his victims into the wilderness, promising them safety if they cooperate. However, being in such a terrifying situation with an armed assailant likely led to overwhelming fear and panic in his victims. When they inevitably tried to escape, Hansen would shoot them, blaming them for their own demise. Hansen's approach appears to have been more about manipulation and control rather than a deliberate hunting expedition akin to the most dangerous game. When he may have viewed his actions as a twisted form of a game, the reality for his victims was a terrifying struggle for survival in the Alaskan wilderness. It seems that the narrative of Hansen using his plane to transport his victims to a remote cabin in the woods may have been exaggerated. In reality, the cabin was more of a meat shack next to a tent frame used by hunters to hang moose meat. This detail, while less glamorous, adds a chilling realism to the story. Hansen's use of the airplane in his crimes was limited, likely only occurring 3 times. However, on the 4th trip, Hansen's plans were foiled when he underestimated one of his victims. On June 11th, 1983, Robert Hansen propositioned Cindy Paulson, offering her $200 for oral sex, a sum well above the typical rate in Anchorage. He took her back to his house while his family was away on a trip to Europe, a routine arrangement during the summer due to marital issues between Hansen and his wife Darla. In the basement, Hansen violently forced Paulson to have sex, then restrained her with handcuffs and a chain around her neck attached to a support beam. The next day, Hansen told Paulson that he was taking her to his cabin in the woods, but promised to return her to Anchorage by 11 a.m. He loaded her into his truck and drove her to Merrill Field, where he kept his plane. However, Paulson managed to escape by bolting out of the car door and running as fast as she could. Hansen chased her, but when he noticed a security guard, he slowed down, allowing Paulson to get away. Paulson flagged down a truck driver named Robert Yunt and asked to be taken to the Big Timber Motel. Despite Yunt's desire to involve police, Paulson refused and instead called her pimp for assistance. The pimp, furious about the situation, armed himself and went to the airport to confront Hansen, but by the time he had arrived, Hansen had already left. After Cindy Paulson's identification of Robert Hansen's aircraft and car, Detective Greg Baker was put on the case. Paulson immediately identified Hansen in a lineup, but Hansen had alibis from friends who claimed he was with them all night fixing an airplane seat, despite their knowledge that they were lying for him as a personal favor. The police searched Hansen's home and found it matching Paulson's description, including the location of the foosball table. However, Hansen's criminal record didn't show up in their search due to the department's transition to a new computer system, giving the impression that he had a clean record. As doubts arose about Paulson's credibility, the police requested she take a polygraph test, which she refused, feeling insulted and frustrated with their lack of belief. With a strained relationship between sex workers and law enforcement, Paulson felt marginalized and decided to leave, not wanting to further involve herself in the investigation. Thankfully, Paulson's case was forwarded to the Alaska State Troopers, where it landed on the desk of investigator Lyle Hogsfin. Hogsfin was also handling the Sherry Moreau case, whose body was found with one of Hansen's shell casings less than a year earlier. This prompted Hogsfin to look into Hansen further. Hansen, who didn't have a pilot's license, would obscure his flight details by painting false registration numbers on his plane and giving fake numbers to air traffic control towers. Remarkably, he had previously claimed to be bipolar during psych evaluations in prison, despite not actually having the disorder, and this fabricated condition provided cover for his erratic behavior. In September 1983, troopers discovered the body of Paula Golding, killed with the same gun used to murder Sherry Moreau. This led to the Canuck River murders being assigned to investigator Glenn Floethe, a gawky but highly meticulous and persistent detective who diligently pieced together the evidence, finally seeing a pattern emerging. Glenn Floethe was the first to look to a broader pattern of missing sex workers in the Anchorage area, identifying commonalities among the victims, like all were in their 20s, between 5'4" and 5'7", and busty, had worked as topless dancers, and had all been arranged high-paying dates with strangers before disappearing. By mid-September, Floethe and Hogsfin joined forces, sealing Hansen's fate. Now, with the records fully transferred, the troopers knew the extent of Hansen's past crimes. Despite mishandling by some of the Anchorage Police Department, including Cindy Paulson's case, officers like Greg Baker were appalled and joined forces with Floethe and Hogsfin to pursue Hansen vigorously. Months after the initial investigation, diligent efforts by a vice cop named Gentile helped locate Cindy, convincing her to cooperate in taking down Hansen. Detective Floethe sought assistance from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico to bolster their case against Hansen. While some sources credit Roy Hazelwood, a founder of the program, others like John Douglas in Mindhunter emphasize his own role. Regardless, Floethe's request was unprecedented, as they aimed to use a behavioral profile to obtain a search warrant, a strategy never before attempted. This innovative approach was a significant departure from standard investigative procedures and marked a pivotal moment in law enforcement tactics. The behavioral profile provided by the FBI was marked accurate and insightful. It suggested that the suspect likely had a speech impediment, potentially a stutter, and may have experienced skin problems as a teenager. Furthermore, the profile indicated that the suspect was an exceptional hunter married to a religious wife who was unaware of his criminal activities. It also suggested that he was a successful businessman and a respected member of the community. Additionally, the profile indicated that the suspect likely possessed a murder bag complete with disguises and possibly took trophies from his victims. This level of detail and accuracy in the profile was impressive and played a crucial role in the investigation against Hansen. The troopers made significant progress in their investigation by comparing the tire marks found near the remote cabins that had been burgled with some tires on Hansen's plane. They discovered a match indicating that Hansen's plane had been in the vicinity of the cabins, and this tightened the net around Hansen, increasing the pressure on him. Meanwhile, Hansen's behavior began to betray his nervousness, evident even in the mundane activities like working at the bakery. The slightest deviation from his usual demeanor caught attention, signaling that something was amiss. Furthermore, a woman who recognized Hansen when she applied for a job at his bakery came forward, providing additional information to the authorities. Her identification of Hansen bolstered this case against him. Finally, after an exhaustive search of Hansen's house, including the attic, the cops were on the verge of giving up because they couldn't find any crucial evidence. However, in a last-ditch effort, Lieutenant Kesnick delved into the attic, sifting through fiberglass insulation in search of the murder weapon. This relentless pursuit eventually paid off, as the search yielded a significant piece of evidence that further undermines Hansen's alibis. Hansen's arrest unfolded with a dramatic flair. He arrived late to work at the bakery, wearing his baker's hat as usual, unaware of the impending arrest. The police swooped in, apprehended him, initiating a raid on his house in his absence. Hansen's wife, who was at home during the raid, was completely taken aback by the sudden intrusion of law enforcement officers. Confused and shocked, she inquired about the reason for their presence, only to be informed that her husband was being arrested for murder. This revelation stunned her, as she had always believed her husband to be innocent and incapable of such heinous acts. In a surprising turn of events, the neighbor's wife, upon hearing about Hansen's arrest, contradicted her husband's assertions of innocence, implying that Hansen had always been lying about his activities. This unexpected revelation exposed the neighbor's complicity or ignorance regarding Hansen's true character, leading to further tension within the discord of the community. Meanwhile, the neighbor who was absent during the raid due to his contracting work found himself implicated in the unfolding scandal. Hansen's arrest not only cast a shadow of suspicion over him, but also triggered a cascade of consequences that would profoundly impact his life and reputation. The neighbor, who was a contractor, had built a boat for Robert Hansen, was away working on another job in King Salmon when Hansen was arrested. Despite his wife's urgent calls urging him to return home and address the situation, he refused and decided not to leave his job until there was official documentation, such as an affidavit requiring his presence. This decision stemmed from his commitment to providing for his family and his reluctance to disrupt his work obligations without proper legal justification. The discovery of the treasure chest in the attic of Hansen's house was a significant breakthrough for the investigators. Inside the chest, they found various items, including Sherry Moreau's arrowhead necklace, a pistol, a .22 caliber rifle, and the coveted .223 caliber Mini 14 rifle. This hard evidence directly tied Hansen to at least 2 of the murders. However, the most disturbing revelation came when police found a map of the Anchorage area inside the chest. The map was marked with a multitude of X's, with some corresponding to the known burial sites of Hansen victims, and what was more chilling was that there were additional X's on the map, suggesting the existence of more unidentified victims. When investigators cross-referenced the locations of these X's with Floaty's victim matrix, they found a significant correlation. Many of these additional X's seemed to correspond to potential grave sites of victims who had not been discovered or identified yet. This discovery shattered Hansen's alibi and provided compelling evidence for his involvement in numerous other murders beyond the ones that he had been linked to previously. Once Hansen returned home, the police informed both him and the individuals involved in his alibi that they would be summoned to testify before a grand jury. They made it clear that lying to the authorities would have serious consequences, and including charges of perjury and significant jail time. Realizing the gravity of the situation and the mounting evidence against Hansen, the individuals involved in his alibi were likely shaken. The police quickly distanced themselves from these individuals, washing their hands of them and focusing on building a case against Hansen based on the substantial evidence that they had gathered. On February 16th, 1984, Hansen's attorneys contacted the prosecution and informed them that Hansen was prepared to clear the docks. This meant that Hansen was willing to plead guilty and confess to the crimes that he had committed, under the condition that his family be spared from the public scrutiny associated with being connected to a notorious serial killer. As a part of his confession, Hansen was taken by helicopter to each specific location marked on his map. However, once he was released to show the troopers the approximate burial spots, Hansen displayed remarkable agility and was able to move through the wilderness swiftly. Despite the presence of a trooper with a high-powered rifle aimed at him, ready to prevent any attempted escape, Hansen moved quickly and efficiently, almost as if driven by instinct to each burial site like a skilled tracker. After locating each burial site, Hansen would kneel down and begin digging. Despite the frozen ground, the cops marked each spot with spray paint on nearby trees. When they returned in the spring after the ground had thawed, they discovered that Hansen had indeed pinpointed the exact right spot each time, and each body was found with only one hole dug. On that day alone, Hansen led them to 12 bodies, some in locations that he hasn't visited in over 2 years. On February 27th, 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison plus life. When asked about his plans for prison, Hansen expressed a desire to become a writer. He mentioned wanting to gain experience by writing humorous stories before eventually writing his own story. Years later, on August 21st, 2014, Robert Hansen passed away from natural causes. Despite the horrific truth about her husband, Darla remained married to him the entire time, never moving on from the heartbreak of unknowingly being married to one of the worst serial killers in the history of the Great White North.